So in this video, I'm going to teach you how to stitch a waistband and how to insert elastic into it. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to construct this waistband, and this waistband is actually made up of two separate parts. Now you can insert elastic into waistbands that are self-faced, so where the channel has been included in the main garment piece. But in this instance, we've got a front waistband and a back waistband. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to attach the waistband pieces. So some sewing patterns will require you to sew the side seams of the main garment and then sew the side seams of your waistband and insert it that way. But in this instance, what I'm going to do is I'm going to insert the front waistband to the front panel and then the back waistband to the back panel first and foremost, and then I'm going to sew up the side seams. I'm just going to pin that and I'll take it to the sewing machine and I'll sew it at 5/8. So you can get elastic in many different colours and many different widths, and I guess what's really important to remember is that if you're making a waistband, you're going to need to make sure that the channel is only fractionally bigger than the width of the elastic. Now, if you're working from a pattern, your sewing pattern will already incorporate the width of your elastic and tell you what elastic width you need to buy. But if you're making a waistband from something that's self-drafted, or you're hacking a pattern and interpreting it in a slightly different way, what you're going to need to do is make sure that you have an appropriate amount of width on the waistband. So here in front of me on this project, I've got a 2.5 centimetre or 1 inch thick elastic, which is very common in amongst sewing. And you can see that if I fold this over on top of it, that's going to fit really nicely into that channel. Now, if I was using a slightly thicker elastic, or I want to adapt this pattern so it was a thicker waistband, I would need to extend this waistband. Or similarly, if I wanted to use a small amount of elastic, I'd need to reduce it. So before you do too much construction, it's really important to make sure that your waistband size is going to match your elastic size. So we're now going to look at the construction of the side seams. Now, when we come to press our waistband, we're going to want to make sure we're pressing it upwards, and we're going to make sure that our seam allowances are pressed up and over the waistband too. We don't want them open or pressed down, we want them pressed up into the waistband. And the reason why is because this will fold over and get sewn onto the other side, and if your seam allowance was tucked down, that would be visible. So we're going to make sure that is all tucked up. But what we want to do is just look at reducing some of the bulk. So I'm going to layer this the seam allowance of the waistband, just to make sure there is as little fabric inside the garment as possible. So I'm going to do that by reducing it down to about 5 to 7 millimeters in size. So these have now been layered and pressed up onto the waistband. So what I'm going to do now is start looking at pinning these side seams. So one thing that is really important to do when you are pinning any sort of intersection of seam allowances is to make sure that you pin it at the seam allowance point. So what you need to do is take a pin, and you're going to travel that down to the stitching point, which is essentially the seam allowance of the garment. And I'm going to place that in on just one single layer. I'm then going to do exactly the same on the other side. So I'm going to travel that down to the seam allowance, which is 5/8. I'm going to place a pin in. And what that does is, if I just pin it that way, is it basically creates a beautiful interchange and a complete alignment at the point you're stitching. The reason why we don't do it on the raw edge is because sometimes you may find that the garments are curved, or there is a slight discrepancy, and the last thing you want to do is come in and stitch it at the seam allowance to realize that actually you're slightly misaligned. So this is called nesting, and it's a really important technique for when you are stitching intersections of seams together. So just before I go and sew this, I just wanted to show you that I've put an extra pin in to keep the seam allowances in position. If you don't have a pin in, quite often what happens is the motion of sewing ends up flipping these over, and you sometimes end up with quite tatty seam allowances. So what I've done is I've put a pin in both sides just to keep them absolutely in position when we come to sew the side seams. So I'll go and do that now. Right, so the side seams have been sewn, and the next thing we're going to need to do is prepare the inside of our waistband. Now, we are going to perform a technique called stitching in the ditch, and stitching in the ditch is basically where you need to sandwich a layer of fabric, normally between 2 layers of cuff or waistband or collar, and you run a stitch along the original stitching line to catch the underside, and so from the outside it looks almost seamless, perfect, and then from the inside you've got this tiny little bit of stitching, just catching everything in. Now this is very tricky to do and requires a little bit of practice, but if you see this little cross section here, this is the front of the garment and this bit is the back, and you may notice that whilst these were cut so that the seam allowance is equal on both the front and the right and the wrong side of the garment, you will need to reduce the seam allowance ever so slightly so there's an overlap on the wrong side of this this garment here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my seam allowance, which is a 5/8, and I'm going to reduce it to about 1/2 inch, which is about 12 millimeters. Okay, and I'm going to pre-fold this, and this is a very common technique used to finish off these sorts of waistbands. So I'm going to pre-fold that, and you may have been instructed in a pattern or been invited to pre-fold this seam allowance before you even start the construction. It doesn't really make a huge amount of difference, to be honest. So I'm going to press this at about 1/2 inch, so it's smaller than this seam allowance. That's sitting good. And then I'm going to fold it again so that the stitching line here is covered up and it's at the halfway point. So I'll do that all the way around. Right, so one of the things that I've just done is I've pressed it all into position, and I have actually run a few pins to make sure that there's ever such a slight overlap on the on that original stitching line, but not too much. So I've just secured it all in, and because the nature of stitching in the ditch means that you have to stitch really close to the edge, pinning it isn't really an option because you also have to sew it from the right side, so you can't really see where you're where you're going. So I'm going to now run a few basting stitches just to keep all of that in position whilst I sew it, because if I don't, I will end up regretting it and making a bit of a mess of it. So I'm going to do a bit of hand tacking just to put all of that in into position, and then we can start looking at stitching in the ditch. Now there is a video on stitching the ditch available, so I'll just link it below, and you can see more details about all the different feet that you can use. Right, so this has been tacked in, so it's not going anywhere, and I'm quite happy with the position of that. So I'm now going to turn it to the right side. I'll take it to the sewing machine to understitch. Right, so this has now been stitched in the ditch, and it was quite a challenging task for my eyes, and I've gone all the way around, except I've left about a 2-inch gap, and the idea is that we will be able to feed our elastic through that. What we need to do now is calculate how much elastic we need. So I have cut a piece of elastic that is exactly the same circumference as this waistband, and in all honesty, if I were to sew it into position like this, it would look very peculiar, because the whole idea of elastic is that you can stretch it onto the body, and the stretch is what really holds it into position. So typically what we try and, or what I tend to advise, is that you want to reduce the amount of elastic to about 70% of the circumference of the waistband. I have got a tape measure here, and I'm going to measure around this waistband like so. Okay, I'm just going to do it in centimetres because I find my brain works slightly better in centimetres. Okay, so I make that about 56 centimetres. So if we were to take about 70%, to about 70%, we're probably looking at about 41 centimetres. So we need to reduce this by that amount. However, we also need to consider that we need to have a little bit of an overlap so we can stitch it in. So if I then take an inch or 2.5 centimetres, so add 5 centimetres to that, I need to take this down to about 46 centimetres. So I'm just going to cut that to size. So we're losing a little bit here. There we go. And there's a little bit of flexibility with elastic because obviously it's stretchy. So I now need to feed that into this channel, and I'm going to use a bodkin, and this is a really great one for elastic. So it's got a claw on it, and then what you can do is grip the elastic and just secure that in place. People often use safety pins as well, and I'm going to start feeding this through the channel, and I want to make sure that this elastic stays flat. So I'm going to start feeding it through, and I'm just going to be mindful that that's going to want to pop through to the side in a layer of the garment, simply because the elastic is shorter than the waistband. So I'm going to be really careful, make sure that doesn't slip through. So the bodkin's now at the other end, and I'm just going to pull this out like so. So when your elastic is like that, we're now in a position to be able to pin that. So as I said, I've left about an inch or 2.5 centimetre overlap. and I'm going to take it to the sewing machine and I'm going to sew it with a box and a zigzag just to secure that all into position. But the first thing I'm going to do is make sure that none of it is twisted. So this has now been stitched in, so I'm going to now just pull that through so it's sitting nice and straight in the garment. And one of the most important things to do when you are working with elastic is that to actually distribute it nice and evenly and give it a good old wiggle, because that really helps. So that's really sitting nicely. So the final thing we need to do now is to finish off this stitch in the ditch just here. And when I finished the stitching, when I did the stitching up to this point, I purposely left a tail thread. I didn't reverse stitch. I purposely left a tail thread so that I could pull it through to the wrong side and secure it that way, so that this stitching would seem seamless on this side. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that back to the machine, finish off that stitching in the ditch, and I may even run a stitch in the ditch up those side seams just to stop it from moving around in the waistband. So I'll go and do that and I'll show you the results. So that's now been finished off, and I have done a couple of extra stitch in the ditches just to stop that from moving. And that there is a perfectly positioned elastic waistband.